Thank you.
Thank you. And before we get started, can everybody hear us all right? Dawoud,
Yes, hello. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm glad to be here with you this evening.
So am I. We already had, the beginning of a longer conversation earlier today. And let's just build on that this evening. Some of you will have noticed walking in that Dawoud Bey had requested we play John Coltrane's A Love Supreme for all of you. And Dawoud, I know many, if not everybody here in the room, will know about your amazing accomplishments as a photographer, but you had other artistic interests before you turned to photography. I know you were writing, and you were also a drummer. So tell us a little bit about, how you turned from, why don't you tell us a little bit about your interest in music and why you chose John Coltrane this evening?
John Coltrane was probably one of my earliest and most significant creative inspirations. I would say that my first encounter with John Coltrane, and this song in particular, A Love Supreme, I would say the shape of the world changed for me at that moment. It opened up. And not just as a drummer and musician, but also the expressive power of very intentionally made art, whether it's music or other forms. And Coltrane was the first time that I got a sense of the transformative capacity of art.
How old do you think you were when that struck you?
Probably 16.
All right, so that's...
Probably 16. I got my first set of drums when I was 14, but somewhere between 14 and 16.
So then that's right around the same time. What were you, 15 when you got your first camera?
Yes, I was. I got my first camera when I was 15 years old from my godmother. It was a camera that had previously belonged to my godfather. My godfather passed away, and we were at my godmother's house for the wake. And before we left, she said, wait 1 minute, I have something that I want you to have. Come upstairs with me. I had no idea what she was going to give me. But we ran upstairs, and she opened up the top drawer of what had been my godfather's dresser, and pulled out a camera. She said, this camera had belonged to your godfather, and I think you should have it. At that moment, I couldn't intuit why she thought I should have it. Many, many, many years later, in 2017, when I was doing a large survey book, Seeing Deeply, and started going through my mother's boxes of things, I found a group of pictures, portraits, informal portraits in the schoolyard that I had made when I was in the 6th grade, which I had completely forgotten about.
That's amazing.
They're like finding this lost piece or forgotten piece of your history. And those pictures made sense why my godmother said, I thought you should have this camera. Because at that point, I was interested in music. I had gotten my first set of drums, was meeting other young musicians in the neighborhood, and she gave me a camera. And that's when that interest in photography began.
Yeah, and you've talked often about the fact that there was this highly controversial exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in 1969, Harlem on My Mind. It was controversial because there was hardly, if any, representation of Black artists. These were images of Harlem, but a lot of photography. And I just want to connect back to what you said about John Coltrane and becoming aware of an artistic vision, perhaps, in the work.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's anything that, as you then turn to taking your own photographs of people in Harlem, where one thing informed the other, or was that more indirect?
Well, the earliest photographs in Harlem were directly informed by, one, the experience of going to see the Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Met, and also by the fact of my own family's history. My mother and father had met in Harlem and lived in Harlem and only moved out of Harlem when I was born. I had an older brother who came along a year and a half before, and I guessed that whatever apartment they had at that point became too small when I came along. And
How it goes in New York.
yeah, and so they moved out of Harlem, even though we continued for many years to visit friends and other family who still lived in Harlem. And so Harlem very much a formative part of my own narrative. And when I began to think about what my own subject matter might be, which I think is a fundamental question for a young artist or a young photographer, what am I going to make work about? I decided that I would begin by revisiting and reestablishing a relationship with the Harlem community by making photographs there. And it turned out to be a very interesting experience because I'll just give you one example. I walked into a barber shop in Harlem one day to see if I could make photographs in there. And when I walked into the barber shop, one of the barbers pointed to me and said, "I know you. You're Kenny May's boy." He had known my mother and father, and just from looking at me, knew that I was their son. And he had known me when I was probably so high, which kind of reminded me that connection to that community was still very much there. So I spent 5 years making the photographs in Harlem. And then when it came time to decide where to show them, there was this question of what does one do with the work once it's shown? Who might be the audience for this work? And one of the controversies around the Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Met was that the work was about the Harlem community, but it didn't seem that the Harlem community had been considered as part of either the construct or the audience for the exhibition. Visiting the Met when I was 16 created what had been a kind of ongoing relationship with the museums in terms of audiences. So when I had to decide where to show that work, I decided that I wanted that work to be seen and to be accessible to the community who were actually the subjects of the work. And so I approached the Studio Museum in Harlem with that kind of intentionality. Like I wanted to show there because the people in the photographs live in this community.
Yeah, and we'll get back a little more to that direct connection. The one thing that struck me reading a little bit about that time period and your own reflections, you spend a lot of time researching that community, walking around Harlem, before you started photographing? And I would imagine, I mean, I would have a hard time approaching a stranger and just asking someone, can I take your photograph? Do you want to share a little bit about your intentionality going into Harlem, taking those photographs, and perhaps your own both conceptual and aesthetic vision that got you launched?
Well, with Harlem, even though I may have had family history in the community, I was acutely aware that I didn't live in that community. So I was a stranger to pretty much everyone in that community. And I was aware by that time of the long history of photographic practice and which one goes into a community, a place, or culture that is not one's own, and then makes work there, and then takes those photographs and presents them in a very different context, which has the tendency of othering the subjects of the work because of the radical difference between place of making and place of exhibiting. So I was aware that even though I was African American in an overwhelmingly African American community, I was still an outsider. I was still a stranger. And for the most part, I didn't see anyone else walking the street pointing their camera at strangers. It was not within the everyday, shape of people's lives. So I thought it was important for me to spend a lot of time in that community, establishing my presence in the community before making any work, and also to familiarize myself with a community that I had not spent time in since I was a child. So I thought this sense of the people in the communities and the community in which I was going to be photographing needed to have a sense of who I was before I began to make work there. That there were particular blocks that I decided I wanted to spend more time photographing on, like West 132nd Street. I just saw somebody from that block just a few days ago, an artist who I knew. And the block felt good when I made good work there, but it probably felt that way because it was very familiar to me by the time I started photographing there, because I spent a lot of time hanging out on that block and even knew people on that block. So this idea that there not be this tension of, I guess, mutual unfamiliarity present in the work was important from the outset, which of course was later expanded in a very real material way with the with the street portraits and Polaroid material.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to get into next, because then you started out with a handheld 35 millimeter camera, and that also, even in your earliest photographs, I think you really have a very considered approach towards your subjects, but then you move to a larger format Polaroid camera that sits on a tripod. And I mean, we talk colloquially about taking a photograph, but what you seem to be doing in these portraits is really, you approach each of these subjects with a lot of respect and dignity, and you give them this incredible presence in those photographs. And those were what, in the late 80s and early 90s? We talked earlier about kind of the history of photography and how you relate to that, because there is this combination of a kind of formal studio photography that you take out in the street when you work with people. Do you want to talk a little bit about that quality and how you relate to a history of photography, or what is important to you?
Well, the street portraits, which became the first time I started making work with a 4x5 camera on a tripod with Polaroid materials, it's a much more deliberate way of making photographs. Certainly very different from the small handheld 35 millimeter camera, which allows you to make pictures of people who are unaware that they're being pictured. And I began to, quite frankly, have some ethical issues with this idea of being in possession of these photographs of African Americans in particular who were unaware of the fact that they had been photographed. And I wanted to begin to address that by finding a way to make the process more reciprocal, more dialogical. How could I address this hierarchy that does exist between photographer and subject, which generally privileges the photographer? And so along with making the photographs with a very different kind of photographic material, 4x5 film gives you materially a very different kind of picture than a 35 millimeter negative. So I wanted to change the material aspect of the photograph in order to make larger photographic prints that still contained a lot of the material information of the subject I was photographing, while also allowing for the making of an instant 4x5 negative and a 4x5 print, which I could then give to the person that I was photographing. So it was a way of addressing multiple things, wanting to make a different kind of photograph, because I'm always acutely aware of the photograph as a photographic object. To me, the photograph is an object. It's not just an image. Yes, there's an image in the object, but it's a particularly made object. And I wanted to make a different kind of photograph materially. So that was the reason for the first shift to a larger camera. And I also, as I said, wanted to address as well this notion of reciprocation, confronting this hierarchy in which I have it, you don't, I present it, you never see it, by using that positive, negative Polaroid material, which no longer exists, but I used it for a number of years. And it allowed me to, well, it allowed the viewer to confirm the way in which I was seeing them, for one thing, and it also allowed them to be in possession of their own photographic image, which I think we often take for granted.
Yeah, and it sounds so simple, but it's actually quite profound. We have a lot of ground to cover, but in this exhibition, and I know a lot of you will have been upstairs already. In this exhibition, there are a number of thematics that also address history and how history is embodied by both people and landscape. And I thought, should we maybe start with the Birmingham project first, because I think chronologically in 2012 that comes before some of the others. And I know you went on your own to Birmingham to research the history of the civil rights movement. What prompted you, because it was years before the photographs were taken, you spent a lot of time researching that history.
A lot of time, somewhere between 7, 8, 9, I think maybe 10 years of just visiting and doing research in Birmingham. But the Birmingham project has its beginnings in an image that appeared in a book called The Movement in 1964. And it was a book of photographs of and about the civil rights movement. And there were a number of horrific photographs in this book, including lynching photographs. The book was published as a fundraising vehicle for the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, which along with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, if you know your history, was one of the primary organizational forces within the civil rights movement. And they collected these photographs. They had an editor collect the photographs, and then they contacted the writer and playwright Lorraine Hansberry and asked Lorraine Hansberry if she could weave a text through these photographs that would give these wide-ranging pictures some kind of coherence. So the book was published in 1964, and my mother and father went to hear James Baldwin lecture at the church that I grew up in. And after Baldwin's talk, they were selling the book downstairs in the church basement. And they bought the book, and they brought the book home. And they didn't tell me, I was 11 years old, and they didn't put the book in my hands and say, you have to look at this book. Because if you tell an 11-year-old that, maybe not, but probably not. So they just left the book on the coffee table or the kitchen table or somewhere where I wouldn't miss it, because I was an infinitely curious kid. I would read the cereal box 5 times. I would read anything. You know, I was just a voracious reader. And so I finally opened the book up, and of all of the horrific photographs in the book, there was a photograph of a young black girl, Sarah Jean Collins, and she was lying wounded in a hospital bed with 2 heavy gauze bandages covering her eyes. And she was the older sister of one of the 4 girls who was killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church the year before. And I saw that photograph, and it was another one of those life-changing, life-reshaping moments. You know, I guess there's my life before seeing that picture and my life after that picture. I don't know that I entirely intuited, and it may well have been one of the reasons that it struck me so deeply. I was pretty much the same age as the girl in the photograph. I don't know if I completely intuited that, but I was. And that picture just seared its way into my psyche. I would have periodic nightmares about that picture. And then one morning, fast forward at least 40 years, maybe 45 years, fast forward 4 decades. One morning, I was laying in bed, and then I sat bolt upright. And I always said, I had heard that term before, but I didn't know what it meant until that moment, to sit bolt upright. Now, it was almost as if someone had smacked me on the back of the head, and I sat bolt upright in bed, and that image came flooding back. I had parked it somewhere in my psyche that I wouldn't think about it too much. Something dislodged it. I wish I knew what. I had a son by then, so it might have had something to do with that. But something dislodged that photograph, and I decided I need to go to Birmingham. You know, I've been living with this since I was 11 years old. So I decided I need to go to Birmingham. I need to, at the very least, see the site where this traumatic incident happened. And so, without knowing anyone, and actually never having been to Birmingham before, I scheduled a weekend trip to Birmingham. It was probably a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, come back Monday. And mainly, I wanted to be there on Sunday so I could attend a service at 16th Street Baptist Church. I needed to see the place. I needed to be in the place. And so I did. And afterwards, I spoke briefly to the minister as he was standing at the back door having a greeting and a word with people as they left. You know, that tradition, service is over, minister stands at the back door, thank you for coming, God bless you, have a good week. So I said hello. I actually stood up when they called for visitors. You go to certain churches, anybody visiting? Visitors, please stand and tell us where you're from. And I stood up and told them I'm from Chicago. Then spoke to the minister on the way out. And he said, what brings you here? I said, well, I'm an artist from Chicago and thinking seriously about making some work here. And he said to me, what do you want to make work about? Now, there was only one thing I'd been thinking about, so the question kind of caught me off guard. And I told him, well, I want to make some work that has something to do, to respond to that moment on September 15th, 1963. And his response to that just got my head spinning and gave me a sense of the real complexity and the contradictions of history. He basically told me that here at 16th Street Baptist Church, we're not about all that business, we're about the business of Jesus Christ. And I was like, oh. And of course, I just said thank you very much, because it's not for me to come from Chicago and tell him what his business should be. And why would that be unusual? The thing that I'm thinking happened in 1963, and I'm standing in his church, some 40-odd years later. But he said, we're not about that business. I'm like, what other business is there, right? But
Dawoud, I just wonder,
as I began to do research,
right,
that response proved to be not at all unusual. The history of that whole moment is full of those kinds of paradoxes. But regardless of that response, I then began making periodic visits to Birmingham, trying to figure out what work I could make that would be adequate to the weight of that history. And it took me several years to figure out conceptually what work to make. I did want to keep it, I wanted to keep it anchored in the idea of the portrait, which is what I was working with, but portraits that represented the present and the past simultaneously. So I originally decided to make portraits of young people who were the same ages as those 6 young people who had been killed that Sunday. Because there were 2 boys that were killed.
What happened? I know we have some younger people here also. I just want to make sure everyone remembers. So September 15th, 1963 is when the Ku Klux Klan bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. There were 4 young girls aged 11
Yeah,
and
there were 4
14.
girls. The girls were 11 and 14. And that same day, a piece of the history that most people don't know that I only found out from going there and doing research, there were 2 African-American boys killed that same day in acts of racist violence that were directly related to what happened that morning. Birmingham that day after the bombing of the church was in a state of real tension and unrest. And in that tension and unrest, a 13-year-old boy was shot by a young white teenager, and 16-year-old Johnny Robinson was shot in the back walking away by a police officer in downtown Birmingham. So once I had that information, I knew that I had to bring these 4 boys into the shape of the work. And, without going through the whole lengthy conversation about the process, it went from making photographs of young African Americans who were the same ages as those 6 young people, in order to give them a more palpable, less mythic presence. The 4 girls, the 4 young girls. I mean, it's a very mythic, way in which they were spoken about. And I wanted to make photographs that gave a very palpable sense of what does an 11-year-old black girl and a 14-year-old black girl or 13 or 16-year-old black boy look like. Because you see an 11-year-old black girl and think about her head being blown off her shoulders. There's very little that's mythic about that. But I felt that making portraits of those young people wouldn't be enough. It didn't resonate strongly enough for me. And so I decided to make portraits of African Americans who were the ages that those 6 young people would have been had they not been killed, which then began to visualize both the past and the present through these young and older subjects. And it also, it was simultaneously a portrait of these African Americans in Birmingham now, as much as it was a portrait, in absentia of these 6 African Americans who had been killed in 1963, to figure out how to visualize that kind of liminal space between the past and the present. How to make the past resonate in work that's made in the contemporary moment.
Yeah, and I think it is also a way where then, all of us as viewers have a very emotive, palpable connection to these individuals, and it's just an extraordinary project. And I was struck to learn that some of the photographs were taken in Bethel Baptist Church, which had its own history with the civil rights movement.
Yeah, Bethel Baptist Church was the church that was pastored by Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, the activist minister in Birmingham, whose house was bombed, who was attacked numerous times by racists and the police in Birmingham for leading demonstrations in that city. It was a very activist church, and Bethel Baptist Church is also the place where the Southern Christian Leadership Conference came into being. It was formed in Bethel Baptist Church. And the other location where the work was made was in the Birmingham Museum of Art, which of course in 1963, like all public institutions in Birmingham and the South, was a segregated institution. Black folks couldn't go into the Birmingham Museum of Art in 1963. So I wanted to use both of those pieces of social history, the black communal space of the church and the segregated space of the museum, as a way of framing the experience of the individuals that I photographed, a way of bringing those 2 pieces of history into the shape of the work as well.
One more question about this project, because looking at these photographs, there must have been so much trust between you and the participants, because they're so keenly aware in the context in which these portraits are being made. Are you still in touch with any of them? Do you hear from them every once in a while?
Yeah, it was interesting because when I went into schools to talk about the project with the young people, uh, hoping that some of them would be interested in participating, and then go home and talk to your parents so your parents could approve and sign off on a release for you to participate. But when I went into the schools and asked these young people, how many of you know what happened on September 15th, 1963? Pretty much all their hands went up. So, they were very much aware of the history that they were living inside of. And I just explained that I wanted to make work about that, and I wanted them to participate in the making of this work, to let people know, what a young black child looks like. I want you to be that person, because in 1963, it could have been any one of you. And so they understood quite clearly what I was trying to do with the work. With the adults, it was very different, because they had all been there at that moment. They remembered that moment. And now here I come from Chicago, stirring up those awful memories that they had just kind of pressed down. And interestingly enough, for all the weeks that I was there looking for people to participate, other than people volunteering and approving their their child to participate, for example, African American men, even the barber shop, I spent time hanging out in the barber shop, hoping to find subjects there. I also knew that the barber himself, Don, was the age that I was looking for, but he never self-volunteered, because it's not something you necessarily want to remember. And now here comes this artist from Chicago, wants you to sit in front of the camera to recall this moment that you really don't want to think about. So the project looked like it was in danger of collapsing until I met Reverend Carolyn Moore McKinstry. And Carolyn McKinstry was the sixth girl who had been in the girls' room when her four friends were killed and one was wounded. She had been there and left the restroom just a couple of minutes before to turn in the Sunday school report. She was the Sunday school secretary, and as service time approached, she realized she needed to turn the report in so that it could be read. And she left, got to the top of the steps, and the explosion went off. So she was someone that I really needed to meet and talk to. And it was a wonderful first meeting and lunch that I had with her. It felt like meeting an old friend. We just liked each other right away. I told her what I was trying to do. And then she said, how's the project going? And usually your instinct is to say, it's going okay. Everything's fine. And I told her, actually, there's a problem. Not a single man has come forward to volunteer for this project. And clearly this project can't work without them. And she said, really? And she pulled out her phone right then and started calling people. Henry, I know you know about this project. And she just made phone call after phone call. And because of the regard with which she is held in that community, people started to come forward. Because you got to understand, I'm calling them, and I'm an artist who's working with the museum that you couldn't go to legally when you were young. And now you want me to come and sit for a picture? I don't know about all of this. Something don't feel right. I mean, I get it. I get it. But once Carolyn McKinstry started making those phone calls on my behalf, because she believed in the project 100%, then those African American men began to come forth. Because if I was okay with Carolyn, then I must be okay.
Amazing. The importance of really having key people who connect within a community is like a great example. By the way, I just want to tell everyone, we're going to go a little longer, and Dawoud is going to be here for 15 minutes after the talk for anyone who has additional questions, but we thought we will just keep the flow going for a little while longer.
Yeah, we don't want to stop talking. We want to just, I think you all came to hear us conversate, so we're just going to keep conversating. And then I'll be here if anybody has any questions that you want to ask. But it was that work that reshaped my thinking about this idea of representing the Black past in the contemporary moment. This idea of making work that occupied this liminal space of past and present simultaneously. And that led to pretty much all the work that came after and the work that I'm doing now, which of course isn't portrait-based.
Yes, exactly. That's where I wanted to go next. I wanted to ask you about the night coming tenderly black. That's, of course, the other large compendium of photographs. No people in these photographs. It's really the landscape that embodies a history. There's also something really exquisite about the tactility of these photographs. Would you just tell us a little bit? You've often worked with institutions in the development of bodies of work, how this one came about and how you got interested in the underground real world.
Night Coming Tenderly Black, I was invited in maybe 2000, I forget the year of that work, 16, 17. I was invited by the Front Triennial in Cleveland, Ohio, to participate in the triennial. And I told them I would if I could continue the history-based work that I was already engaged in. I didn't want to stop that work to take on a project in Cleveland that had nothing to do with what I was thinking about. I wanted to see if I could do that and keep thinking through this idea of visualizing history. And so my research quickly revealed that Cleveland, Ohio, and northeastern Ohio was very central to the Underground Railroad and the movement of fugitive, once enslaved African Americans towards Lake Erie in Cleveland. So once I realized there was some history that I could begin to research and think about, I agreed to participate in the Front Triennial. And that work, people often say that there are no people in them or no figures in them. But the way I actually think about it is that the person has actually moved from being in front of the camera to behind it, because I'm making those photographs from the vantage point of someone moving through that landscape. Looking at the landscape as if through their eyes, wanting to create a sense not only of what it looks like to be in this state of fugitivity moving through the landscape, but also what it feels like materially, what that landscape looks and feels like, imagined through the eyes of a fugitive African American making their way to freedom. So that dictated the position of the camera in relation to the landscape. It wasn't just in terms of making interesting landscape photographs about, it was about trying to see that landscape through their eyes. And then, of course, because the Underground Railroad is shrouded in as much myth as it is fact, of necessity, the locations, the so-called Underground Railroad stations or safe houses could never be known. The fugitive slaves took temporary refuge. These places could not be known, which was fine with me because I wasn't looking to document that movement or those places, but to imagine and reimagine that landscape. So the lack of a lot of specific information gave me the space to begin to reimagine that landscape. The work was also informed and inspired by Langston Hughes' poem. There's a poem by Langston Hughes in which the last couplet of the poem is night coming tenderly, black like me. This idea of the blackness of night, the blackness of the landscape, and thinking about that as a tender space through which one moves. And then the other inspiration for that work is the photographs of Roy DeCarava. Photographs about African American experience realized through these very dark, rich photographs. You're thinking about this black narrative and the black subject embodied within this very dark object, this photograph. And I've always used one of my initial influences, DeCarava. And his work gave me a suggestion to the material realization of that work, to collapse the blackness of the photographic object, the blackness of the narrative, and the blackness of the fugitive African American who's not present in the photograph, but is actually the person through whom the landscape is being viewed. So those are my kind of conceptual, historical points of reference in making the work. The other thing to realize is much like DeCarava's work, which are very dark, but they weren't made in spaces that were that dark. It's an interpretation of an experience. So those photographs of night coming tenderly black were not made at night, because technically it's impossible to make photographs at night that have that much material information in them. So they were made at different times of the day and then printed to realize my conceptual idea of, the blackness of space through which these fugitive African Americans were moving through. Some of the places are actual Underground Railroad sites. Most of them are not. If there was a known safe house here, I might find an interesting place to make a photograph over there, which makes perfect sense because in order to get there, you have to pass by here, Yeah, so I'm not just trying to document a place as much as I'm trying to make work about, the physical movement through this landscape on the way to Lake Erie. That work is certainly the most technically daunting work I've ever made. To realize that kind of print in a silver print of that size. I tried initially experimenting with different inks and paper, and then I realized Roy DeCarava didn't print in ink. The reason they look the way they do is because they're silver prints. And in a silver print, the silver halides are actually embedded in the surface of the paper, which is one of the things that give them that sense of three-dimensionality. So it took a lot of back and forth to figure out the tonality, the degree of darkness, the contrast, the degrees of legibility. It was a difficult project, you know.
And I know that you did this whole series of the plantation photographs, and right now you were just in Richmond editing. Do you want to tell people a little bit about the Richmond project and where this investigation and history of American history is taking you right now?
Right now.
Right, if you want.
I'm photographing in Richmond, Virginia, continuing this history project. This project of making large-scale photographs, because I want the photographs in their sense of scale to also embody the experience in a way that it becomes an experience rather than an object kind of experience where you're looking at a photograph and you're hyper aware that you're looking at a photograph. I want, through the scale, for the work to kind of envelope you, for you to be able to enter into those landscapes. And if you stand close enough to them, that is what happens. There's very little peripheral vision left. But there's a site in Richmond, Virginia called the Richmond Slave Trail. And if you know your history, you know that Virginia is kind of like the epicenter of the enslavement project here in America. And this still visible trail in Richmond that the James River runs parallel to. You know, there's the James River, and then the enslaved Africans were brought to the dock and then walked to the stockades and other places where they were kept before being auctioned off, either in Virginia or, you know, because Virginia was the site of export that supported the slavery industry. That trail is still very visible, and upwards of 350,000 enslaved African Americans were walked into slavery, having their first encounter with the Americas on that trail. So I've been engaged with that probably for the past 2 years or so, doing research, and then finally I've begun photographing in and around that landscape. And also, as I did with Birmingham and Louisiana, I've made a video work in that site as well. So I'm still working with both the still large-scale photographic image and the moving image and sound. That work is going to open November, a year from now, at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. It's going to be the work that I'm making right now in Virginia. It's going to be Night Coming Tenderly Black. It's going to be all of the history projects brought together in one exhibition. And what I imagine is going to be a wonderful book, too, because it's going to be a book that will be done of all of those projects.
Well, we better all mark our calendars for next November, because I think seeing all of these together will be incredible. If we have a few more minutes, yes. Can we just go back to New York for a moment to think about the Harlem Redux? I mean, you went back to revisit Harlem, which has obviously undergone tremendous changes. It's also a history project of sorts.
It is, and it's the first. You know, I'm trying to conflate this conversation and make it, but Harlem Redux is the first project in which I began to look at the narrative of place, and in that case, the urban landscape undergoing extraordinary transformation due to the forces of gentrification, global capital being run through that community. And I wanted to make some work about how that community was being transformed, how the physical and social geography of that community was being transformed through these forces. I wanted to insert myself into that moment and make work and not make contemporary portraits of Harlem or something that was portrait related. So that was the first work when I began to work out my picture making language around, how to visualize the narrative of space and place in relation to history. That was very difficult work. That shift from the portrait to what's generally called by genre landscape took place for the first time with that work. And like any change that one attempts to make in their work, it was not easy, not at all. I won't even go into how difficult it was, but eventually I began to find the language, because when you make that kind of change, you have to find the language, the conceptual and the formal and the material language. Like all of the other history projects that I've gone on to do, they're black and white, because black and white is kind of like the photographic material of history.
Right.
Harlem Redux is happening right now. So I wanted them to be large scale, color, conspicuously contemporary, because this is right now. So eventually I began to keep working, and picture by picture, I began to build that project. But if you had to ask me what was one of the most recent challenges that you've had, it would be figuring out the beginnings of Harlem Redux, because there was a language that I had never attempted before, to not talk about the human subject in front of the camera, but to look at place and to give that some kind of coherent and resonant form.
Yeah, and also those spaces you walk, those objects we use, they really come alive in that series. It's wonderful. By the way, I know we have to kind of wrap this up here, but in case you were wondering why there is this one odd constellation of photographs, that is because it's a work in our collection that's Dawoud Bey's Pissed Off. That was kind of a different register of work. It's a work that's going to go on view in our galleries in about 2 or 3 weeks or so in the modern and contemporary galleries. And Dawoud warned me earlier, he's like, don't ask me to reveal the secrets of that particular sauce. But if you have anything you can share, for instance, what made you decide to release the photographs relatively recently?
Yeah, I've been collaborating with David Hammons for a long time, going back to the 70s. And those of you who know David's work and know about David know that he's not really available for discourse about his work. He still doesn't have a phone. You have to reach him through parties which only certain people know who they are. He's just not available in that way. He makes his work. He doesn't want to be, the explanations and the explaining and the discourse. Early on there was never a press release sent out for anything he did, because his audience was the people in Harlem or Brooklyn or whatever community he was making this work in. And so I've been making photographs of his work for a long time, but also honoring his desire that there be some discretion exercised in terms of how available the work would be, because he really, is a believer in creating things that, since most people never see them, the earlier work in particular, they become these fascinating things of the imagination. And stories get told about them, you know. So they're meant to exist in that kind of space. I always made the photographs, gave a set of 8x10s to David, done. And then more recently, of course, as David has gotten older, as I've gotten older, I felt that the work needs a full accounting. People, in fact, do need to know the work that he made, do need to know because its significance to the discourse around art of our time is very clear. And I thought there needed to be some visual piece of that could also be seen. So I finally started, making photographs of those, making prints of that work, and offering them to institutions so that work would not be lost, basically, so that it would be more than a group of interesting stories about a fascinating black man who lived at one time. I began to feel that I wanted to be, that I wanted that work to be taken into historical account in a way that was different from people furtively looking for pictures of it in magazines from the 80s, or to just make that work available.
Well, we keep circling around history in many different registers, clearly. We could go on forever. However, I know some of you will want to come up and maybe have, some questions for Dawoud as well. Let me take this opportunity to thank you for your time, for your generosity. We are thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, everyone.
I'm not looking to be inundated, but if you have, but if you have any meaningful question for me that you would ask, it can be whatever. Shouldn't be a question about photography and technical and lenses and digital and all of that, because I don't care about that. What kind of camera should I buy? I don't know. I've never bought a new camera in my life,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but thank you. And thank you all for coming out this evening.
Thank you. Come on up.